The hall of petition was never quiet, even when no one spoke. It breathed. The sound came from the ceiling, where transparent layers of smart crystal drifted in slow orbital patterns, adjusting gravity, light, and acoustics in anticipation of significance. Elias felt it in his boots, a faint vibration like a patient machine clearing its throat. He stood exactly where the floor markings told him to stand, because the floor always knew better than people. He had been here once before, years ago, as part of a maintenance crew repairing a collapsed memory archive after a solar surge. Back then, no one had noticed him. Today, everyone did. That was the first joke the universe seemed to be telling him, and Elias privately appreciated a good sense of irony. Rows of nobles occupied floating tiers that curved upward like the inside of a shell. Their garments shimmered with status-coded pigments, shifting hues in response to rank, lineage, and mood. Several were already bored. Elias could tell. Boredom had a very specific shade among the Aurelian elite, somewhere between smug silver and disappointed teal. At the far end of the hall, the throne platform hovered a meter above the floor, supported by fields no one had bothered to explain to civilians. Queen Ashera sat there with the practiced stillness of someone who had learned that even breathing could be interpreted as policy. She looked human at first glance, which was intentional. The long ears, elegant and tapered, swept back through her dark hair like a quiet declaration that first glances were rarely sufficient. Elias resisted the urge to wave. He had been told explicitly not to wave. A herald drone drifted forward, its voice warm and artificially humble. It recited Elias's accomplishments in a tone usually reserved for natural disasters that chose not to happen. Entire systems saved, millions of lives preserved, a catastrophic cascade halted because Elias had ignored 3 protocols and followed a hunch instead. The drone concluded by listing the traditional boon awaiting him, pausing just long enough for expectation to stretch and settle. The court leaned forward. Somewhere to Elias's left, someone lost a small bet. Queen Ashera raised one slender hand, and the hall fell into a silence so precise it felt engineered. Her gaze rested on Elias, sharp without being unkind, curious without being inviting. "Elias of no house," she said, because he had none, and because she never missed an opportunity to be accurate. "You are granted a boon. Speak it." This was the part everyone loved, the predictable part. Elias could feel their confidence pressing in on him, a collective certainty that he would choose correctly. Land, title, a research grant large enough to develop a moon with a personality problem. Someone behind him whispered, "He'll ask for a governorship," with the bored certainty of a person ordering the same meal every time. Elias cleared his throat. The sound echoed too much. He smiled despite himself. "Your Majesty," he said, and immediately wished he had practiced saying that without sounding like he was apologizing for it. She inclined her head. The throne hummed softly, as if encouraging efficiency. Elias took a breath and said, "You." For half a second, nothing happened. Then everything tried to happen at once. Translation matrices stuttered, uncertain whether the word had been metaphorical, grammatical, or criminal. A security drone twitched hard enough to collide with a decorative banner. Somewhere high above, a legal advisory algorithm began screaming silently in 12 dead languages. The court erupted, not into chaos but into scandal, which was far louder. Voices overlapped, outrage and delight competing for dominance. Elias caught fragments as they washed over him. Impropriety, precedent, audacity. Is he serious? Does he mean possession? Someone checked the old treaties. Queen Ashera did not move. That was the most alarming thing of all. She raised her hand again, and the hall obeyed like a chastened machine. Her expression was unreadable, which Elias suspected took effort. "Clarify," she said calmly. Elias swallowed. The tension snapped just enough for him to think, which was fortunate, because he had not planned this part beyond hoping to still be alive for it. "Not in the way they think," he said, gesturing vaguely at the tears, earning a few offended gasps. "I don't want your crown, or your power, or anything like that. I want your time, conversation. I want to know who you are when no one is watching and no one is keeping score." A pause followed, different from the first. Curious, uncomfortable, the kind that made room for thought. Queen Ashera studied him, really studied him, and something in her eyes shifted, infinitesimally. Around them the court waited, breath held, already preparing to misunderstand whatever came next. For a moment, the hall did not know what to do with itself. It had been engineered to process treason, declarations of war, spontaneous religious awakenings, and once an ill-timed proposal involving a ceremonial eel. This, however, sat awkwardly between categories. Queen Ashera leaned back slightly, which caused the throne to adjust its field geometry with a faint sigh. The throne was very old and deeply opinionated about posture. Her fingers rested together, precise and still, while 1,000 predictive systems quietly revised their forecasts and found nothing usable. Elias watched all of this with the detached fascination of someone who had already jumped off a cliff and was now curious about the wind. "You are requesting," Ashera said slowly, "access to the monarch." Several nobles inhaled sharply, as if the word itself were radioactive. Elias nodded. "Yes, but not the monarch part, the other part." A low murmur rippled outward. Someone laughed, nervously, then stopped when no one else joined. Humor in the court was permitted, but only retroactively. Ashera's gaze flicked briefly to her left, where a thin arc of light indicated the presence of her senior advisory array. It pulsed once, twice, then froze, evidently choosing silence over embarrassment. She returned her attention to Elias. "You understand," she said, "that I am not a metaphor." "I've noticed," Elias replied before he could stop himself. He winced internally, then added, "Respectfully." One of the nobles actually snorted. Another looked scandalized by the snort and made a note to remember it forever. The queen's lips twitched. It was subtle, almost theoretical, but it happened. "Most who stand where you stand," she said, "desire permanence. Land endures, titles endure. Even power, if managed well, can last a generation or two. You ask for something immeasurable. That's why it seemed polite to ask instead of steal," Elias said. "Also, I don't think I could carry land out of the hall." A few heads turned, uncertain whether they were allowed to smile. The hall's ambient intelligence dimmed the lights by a fraction, a common response to conversational instability. Ashera studied him again, this time with something sharper beneath the curiosity. "You realize," she said, "that this court will interpret your request as either naive, manipulative, or obscene." "I'm hoping for all three," Elias said, in moderation. That did it. Laughter broke through the tension, brief and scattered, like static discharge. A protocol officer visibly panicked, then relaxed when the queen did not have anyone removed. Ashera rose from the throne. The movement silenced everything. The throne lowered itself obediently behind her, offended at being abandoned mid-scene. She descended the short ramp toward Elias, her long ears catching the light, their delicate structure revealing faint lines of bioluminescent circuitry beneath the skin. Aurelian biology was elegant that way, organic forms carrying technology so seamlessly that even most scientists forgot it was there. She stopped an arm's length away. Elias became acutely aware of how tall she was, how composed, how tired her eyes looked up close. "You asked for conversation," she said. "Why?" Elias did not answer immediately. He had learned, during his years in systems repair and emergency response, that rushing answers caused explosions. "Because," he said at last, "everyone here speaks to you as if you are permanent, immutable, a structure. No one asks how it feels to be the thing that cannot fail." A hush settled again, heavier this time, not scandalous, uncomfortable. Ashera held his gaze. The court watched, hungry and confused. Somewhere a historian fainted quietly. "You presume much," she said. "Yes," Elias agreed readily. "I'm told that's a survival trait." For several seconds, nothing moved. Then Ashera turned away from him and faced the tears. "The boon," she said, her voice carrying effortlessly, "is granted." Chaos flared, then stalled when she lifted her hand again. "Conditionally." That word fell like a carefully placed weight. She outlined the terms with surgical precision. Scheduled meetings, neutral locations. No political discourse unless initiated by her. No requests layered within requests. Their conversations would be recorded, encrypted, and sealed beyond access, even hers, until a time determined by law or catastrophe. Improper conduct would end the arrangement immediately. Improper interpretation by the court would be ignored. As she spoke, Elias felt something settle into place. He had not won anything. He had been given responsibility. The nobles reacted in waves: outrage, suspicion, disbelief, and, in a few cases, envy sharp enough to be visible. A junior courtier whispered, "He's going to get himself killed," with something like admiration. Ashera turned back to Elias. "You asked for me," she said quietly. "You will find that I am not simple." "I was hoping," Elias said, "that neither of us would be." Another pause. This one stretched, then softened. "Very well," Ashera said. "We begin tomorrow." She turned and ascended the ramp, the throne rising to meet her like a relieved accomplice. As the hall slowly exhaled, Elias remained where he was, aware that he had just asked for the most dangerous thing in the empire and been told yes. Somewhere above, the hall adjusted its parameters again, uncertain whether history had just been made or politely mocked. Elias discovered very quickly that being granted access to the queen did not include being told where to go. The summons arrived precisely at the appointed time, delivered not by a guard or herald, but by a thin ribbon of light that slipped under his door and rearranged the room's gravity just enough to wake him. A calm voice, pleasant, genderless, and clearly incapable of sarcasm, announced that he was expected to proceed to location pending, and then politely declined to elaborate. He stood in the middle of his temporary quarters, boots half laced, staring at the air. "Of course," he muttered, "that narrows it down." The door slid open on its own. The corridor beyond looked different than it had the day before, which Elias suspected was intentional. The Aurelian Palace was famous for being architecturally adaptive, a polite way of saying it rearranged itself whenever it felt like it. Floors shifted, walls curved where none had been, and the lighting adjusted to moods no one admitted having. He followed the corridor anyway. It seemed like the kind thing to do. Along the way, he passed 3 officials pretending not to watch him. One stared intently at a wall display that showed nothing but a slowly rotating mathematical constant. Another examined her wrist implant with exaggerated focus. The third simply froze mid-step, as if hoping invisibility would kick in retroactively. "Morning," Elias offered. None of them responded. One of them did, however, flinch. The corridor eventually opened into a small chamber that felt aggressively unimportant. No banners, no status glyphs, no visible surveillance nodes, which meant there were definitely surveillance nodes. A single table occupied the center, circular and plain, accompanied by 2 chairs that did not hover, glow, or judge. Queen Ashera was already there. She was not wearing a crown. That, Elias realized distantly, was the most alarming thing he had seen since entering the palace. Her clothing was simple by court standards, dark fabric woven with subtle adaptive threads that responded to temperature and stress rather than politics. Her long ears were uncovered, relaxed, no ceremonial bindings restraining them into formal lines. She stood by the table, examining a small object hovering above her palm, a projected star map, its points shifting as probabilities updated. "You're late," she said without looking at him. Elias glanced back at the doorway. "I arrived exactly when summoned. I just took the scenic route. The palace and I are still negotiating boundaries." She lowered the projection, which dissolved into nothing. "The palace does that," she said. "It dislikes predictability. I'm starting to feel like I'm being assessed by the furniture." "That means it likes you," she replied. Then she sat. Elias hesitated, then took the opposite chair. It did not move, hum, or correct his posture. He found that strangely unsettling. For a moment, neither of them spoke. This silence was different from the one in the hall. There, silence had weight, ceremony, expectation. Here it felt undecided. Ashera studied him openly now, without the distancing lens of courtly protocol. "You are aware," she said, "that this arrangement has already generated 17 theories, 4 formal complaints, and 1 attempted poem." Elias winced. "Was it a bad poem?" "It rhymed destiny with dynasty," she said flatly, "which should be illegal." He smiled despite himself. "I apologize for any cultural damage I may have caused." "You have caused considerable cultural damage," she said. "It is oddly refreshing." Another pause, a softer one. You asked for conversation, Ashera continued. So speak. Elias opened his mouth and closed it again. He had imagined this moment, but imagination had not accounted for the absence of an audience. I thought, he said slowly, that I'd start by asking how you are. Then I realized no one has probably ever let you answer that honestly. Her expression did not change immediately. When it did, it was almost imperceptible. How I am, she repeated as if testing unfamiliar syntax. Yes, Elias said. Not how the empire is. Not how the projections are trending. Just you. Ashera leaned back slightly. The chair did not protest. I am, she said after a long moment, adequate. Elias waited. Her ears flicked just once. You are not satisfied with that answer. No, he agreed, but I respect the effort. That earned him a quiet exhale that might have been laughter. Very well, she said. I am tired, I am curious, and I am unaccustomed to this. To chairs that don't float, he offered. To being spoken to without an agenda, she replied. They sat with that for a while. The room's lighting warmed subtly, responding to something neither of them acknowledged. Ashera gestured to the empty table. Tell me something about yourself that is not on record. Elias considered. I'm afraid of small spaces, he said, which is unfortunate, because half my career involved crawling through collapsing maintenance tunnels while pretending I wasn't terrified. Why pretend? Because everyone else was more afraid than I was, he said, and panic is contagious. She regarded him thoughtfully. That is an inefficient form of courage, she said. It's the only kind I've got. Silence again. Comfortable now. Dangerous in its ease. Outside the room, the palace continued its endless calculations, while inside, two people, one who ruled an empire and one who repaired it when it broke, began the slow, improbable work of being known. The second meeting was scheduled with the kind of precision that suggested someone, somewhere, was deeply uncomfortable with the concept of a second meeting at all. Elias arrived early, which he immediately regretted when the room did not acknowledge his presence in any way. It remained stubbornly empty, silent, and aggressively neutral. He paced once, stopped, and then decided pacing looked suspiciously like nervousness, so he leaned against the wall instead. The wall subtly adjusted its temperature, as if to say it would prefer not to be leaned on emotionally. When Queen Ashera entered, she did so without announcement. One moment the room contained only Elias and an uncooperative wall, and the next it contained a ruler of several star systems who looked faintly irritated by the concept of doors. You're early, she observed. I panicked, Elias said honestly. I was worried the palace would move again, and I'd end up accidentally attending a tax summit. That has happened, she said, removing her outer mantle and placing it on the table. Once to me, he blinked. You accidentally attended your own tax summit? Yes, she replied. I was very persuasive. They sat. The table displayed nothing, which Elias now understood was intentional. No data feeds, no holograms, no agendas. It felt like sitting inside a held breath. Ashera regarded him for a moment. You are being watched more closely than you realize. I assume that was part of the package, Elias said. Do I get a rating? You are currently classified as statistically improbable, she said. That is not a compliment. I'll work on being more predictable, he said, or less. I'm unclear which would make everyone happier. Her lips curved faintly. Neither. The silence settled again, but this time it carried familiarity. Ashera folded her hands, the faint bioluminescent lines beneath her skin pulsing softly, responding to her heart rate rather than any external system. Elias noticed and decided not to comment, which he suspected was the correct choice. You asked me how I am, she said at last. You did not ask again. I figured I shouldn't rush, Elias said. That kind of question needs time to breathe. She inclined her head slightly. Very well. Today I will answer more accurately. Elias waited, careful not to lean forward too eagerly. He had learned that queens notice posture the way engineers notice stress fractures. I am surrounded, Ashera said, constantly, by people, by systems, by projections of myself generated by others. There are 73 versions of me currently in active circulation across the empire. None of them are comfortable. That sounds exhausting, Elias said. It is efficient, she corrected, then paused. And exhausting. She stood and began to pace slowly, her long ears shifting with her movement, free of ceremonial restraint. I am required to be decisive, but never impulsive, compassionate, but never partial, accessible, but never familiar. I am advised, analyzed, corrected, and preserved. I am maintained. Elias watched her, feeling the weight of each word settle into the room. When was the last time someone asked what you wanted? He asked. She stopped, turned. I am asked that question constantly. No, he said gently. I mean without expecting the answer to align with policy. Ashera's gaze sharpened. That is a dangerous distinction. Most useful ones are, Elias said. She considered that, then returned to her seat. The chair adjusted slightly as if relieved to have her back. I want, she said slowly, to be unobserved. Briefly. Not hidden. Simply unmeasured. Elias smiled. I recommend maintenance tunnels. No one respects them enough to install expectations. I am familiar, she said dryly. I once spent 3 hours in one after a diplomatic reception went creatively. He laughed before he could stop himself. I wish there were records. There are, she replied. They are sealed, classified, and deeply embarrassing. The room's ambient systems hummed softly, recalibrating as their voices overlapped for the first time. Elias felt something ease, like a pressure valve opening just a fraction. Do you regret granting my request? He asked, surprising himself. Ashera did not answer immediately. Regret implies error, she said. I would say uncertainty. I can work with that, Elias said. Uncertainty is honest. Her ears flicked again, quicker this time. You are unusually comfortable speaking to me. I'm not, he said. I'm just more afraid of pretending I am. That earned him a look, sharp, assessing, and unexpectedly warm. You are aware, she said, that if this continues, the court will eventually demand an explanation. I'm counting on it, Elias said. By then, maybe they'll be too confused to stop us. She laughed then, softly, briefly, and with clear surprise at herself. The sound seemed to catch in the room, as if the walls were unsure how to process it. Outside, the palace adjusted its probabilities again. Inside, the fourth conversation unfolded, not as a matter of state, but as something rarer, two lives intersecting without permission from history. By the fifth meeting, the palace had stopped pretending it didn't know what was happening. Corridors no longer rearranged themselves dramatically when Elias walked through them, which he took as either acceptance or quiet judgment. Doors opened a second faster than necessary. Lighting adjusted to his preference without asking. Once, a wall display briefly flashed a reminder about appropriate conversational boundaries, then apologized and erased itself. He decided not to mention that to Ashera. She already had enough entities attempting to manage her expectations. This time, the room was different. Not larger or more ornate. If anything, it was simpler. But the ceiling was transparent, revealing a slow drift of stars beyond the palace's orbital shell. The sight tugged at something old in Elias, the part of him that had once believed space was romantic before discovering it was mostly inconvenient and occasionally on fire. Ashera stood near the window, her back to him, hands clasped behind her. She was wearing pale clothing today, woven with adaptive threads that caught the starlight and bent it gently rather than reflecting it. Her long ears were loose again, unbound, signaling informality more clearly than any declaration. You're staring, she said without turning. I'm admiring the ceiling, Elias replied. It has excellent taste. She glanced back at him. You are aware that this view is classified. I promise not to tell anyone, he said. I'd probably get the coordinates wrong anyway. She returned her attention to the stars. The court believes I am testing you. That's fair, Elias said. I've been testing them for years without permission. Ashera moved to the table and sat, gesturing for him to do the same. The table this time displayed a single object between them, a small, rotating construct of light, its geometry constantly folding in on itself. What am I looking at? Elias asked. A probability knot, she said. A visual compression of current court speculation. He leaned closer. It looks angry. It is, she said. You are currently theorized to be a long-term infiltrator, an accidental genius, a social experiment, and a cult leader. Not necessarily in that order. I've always wanted followers, Elias said. Do they get uniforms? Only after the third scandal. He chuckled, then sobered as the construct shifted, its angles tightening. Does it bother you? He asked. That they speculate? Ashera replied. No, that they cannot imagine sincerity, she considered. A little. The probability knot dimmed and vanished. Silence filled the space it left behind, comfortable but alert. Ashera folded her hands. I have been advised to end this. Elias did not react immediately. He had learned that reacting too fast made things worse. Any particular reason? He asked. You are altering variables, she said. My speech patterns, my decision timing, my tolerance for ambiguity. That sounds serious, he said. Am I contagious? Yes, she replied. Profoundly. He smiled faintly. Then why haven't you ended it? Ashera looked at him directly. Because for the first time in decades, my thoughts feel like my own before they become policy. That landed heavier than any proclamation. Elias leaned back, exhaling slowly. I'm glad, he said, but if this is too much— It is, she interrupted, then softened. And I choose it anyway. Outside, a streak of light crossed the starfield, a courier vessel jumping lanes. Elias watched it disappear. You know, he said, if anyone ever asks, we could tell them we're discussing trade routes. We are discussing trade routes, Ashera said calmly. You trade irreverence. I trade context. Unbalanced exchange, he said. You underestimate the value of irreverence, she replied. It reminds me that power is not synonymous with importance. They sat with that for a while. The room's ambient systems adjusted, lowering gravitational resistance just enough to make breathing feel easier. Ashera spoke again, quieter this time. Do you know why I granted your request? I assumed curiosity, Elias said. That was part of it, she admitted. But mostly you asked for something I could refuse. He frowned. I thought that was the whole risk. It was the point, she said. Everyone else asked for what cannot say no. You asked for me. Elias absorbed that, nodding slowly. I won't abuse it, he said. I know, Ashera replied. That is why the court is afraid. A faint smile passed between them, shared and fleeting. Outside, the stars continued their indifferent drift, unaware that within the palace, a queen and a man without a house were quietly rewriting the most dangerous contract in the empire. Not with ink or law, but with time freely given. By the sixth meeting, they had stopped pretending these conversations were an experiment. The room this time was not in the palace proper. Elias realized that immediately, because the walls did not hum with anticipatory awareness. They were quiet in a way that suggested neglect rather than intention. Old alloy panels lined the chamber, scarred by time and patched with newer materials that did not quite match. A maintenance emblem, faded almost beyond recognition, marked one corner. Elias smiled. You brought me somewhere illegal. Ashera stepped in behind him and sealed the door with a gesture that bypassed 3 visible systems and at least 5 invisible ones. Not illegal, she said. Forgotten. The palace dislikes forgotten places. They cannot be optimized. That explains why I like it, he replied. The gravity here was imperfect. Not enough to be dangerous, just enough to be noticeable. Elias felt slightly taller, lighter, like his body was considering options. Ashera removed a small device from her sleeve and set it on a crate that had once held coolant coils. The device pulsed once, then went dark. No recordings, she said. No predictive overlays. No advisors screaming quietly in my head. That seems reckless, Elias said. Yes, she agreed. I am enjoying it. They sat on opposite sides of the crate, which complained faintly but held. The silence here was different again. Not careful, not ceremonial, just empty. Ashera leaned back, looking up at the exposed conduit lines running along the ceiling. This section predates my reign, she said. It was used during the early expansion years. Before the court learned how to be elegant about power, Elias followed her gaze. I've noticed power usually starts ugly and gets better at hiding. Her ears shifted and what he had learned was amusement. You continue to say things no one else would survive saying. I have a very reassuring face, he said. She snorted. Actually snorted. Then froze, eyes widening slightly, as if waiting for consequences that never came. Elias raised an eyebrow but said nothing. After a moment she relaxed. That sound, she said slowly, has not left my mouth since I was a child. Well, Elias said, I feel honored and slightly concerned. She laughed then, more fully, and the sound echoed oddly off the metal walls. It wasn't polished, it wasn't restrained. It startled them both. When it faded, Ashera covered her face briefly with one hand. If anyone heard that, they'd assume a structural failure, Elias said. Very on brand for this place. They sat there, shoulders loosening, the weight of the crown, literal and metaphorical, absent for once. Ashera's long ears drooped slightly, no longer held in alert formality. Elias found himself thinking, not for the first time, that she looked younger like this. Not less powerful, just less alone. I need to ask you something, she said. Dangerous phrase, Elias replied, but go ahead. Do you ever feel, she began, then paused, frowning as if selecting words from a language she rarely used, that your life is observed even when no one is watching? He considered. Only when I'm doing something stupid, he said, which is most of the time. She shook her head. I mean, shaped, anticipated, as if every version of you has already been decided and you are merely performing the most statistically acceptable one. Elias's humor softened. Yes, he said quietly, but I learned to misbehave in small ways. It keeps the model confused. Her eyes met his, sharp and intent. You disrupt models simply by existing, she said. Do you know how rare that is? I assumed it was a side effect of poor planning. A faint smile touched her lips. That may be the most comforting explanation. The lights flickered briefly as an ancient power relay compensated for their combined mass shifting at the same time. Elias glanced at the ceiling. If this place collapses, history will be very annoyed. It already is, Ashera said. History dislikes being interrupted. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. I have been queen for 32 standard cycles, she said. In that time, I have never once spoken without considering how my words would be recorded. And now, Elias asked. Now, she said, gesturing vaguely around them. I do not even know if this room remembers me. That's a relief, he said. I hate disappointing rooms. Her laughter returned, quieter this time, but steadier. They talked then, not about policy or speculation or danger, but about small human things. Elias told her about a station chef who cooked exclusively with spite. Ashera admitted she once renamed an entire star because the original designation was ugly. That's abuse of power, Elias said. Yes, she replied serenely. It is my favorite kind. Time moved strangely in the forgotten chamber. When Ashera finally stood, stretching slightly, Elias felt the shift immediately. The air thickened, just a little, reality reasserting itself. We should return, she said. Probably, Elias agreed, before someone realizes you've gone missing. They would notice eventually, she said. The empire tends to unravel when I am unsupervised for too long. At the door, she hesitated. Elias, she said. Yes? You see me, she said. Not as a question, as a statement. He met her gaze. You let me, he replied. That Elias knew was the most dangerous truth either of them had spoken yet. The court eventually did what courts always did when ignored for long enough. It demanded clarity. The demand arrived wrapped in courtesy, delivered through 6 committees, 3 advisory councils, and one deeply offended algorithm that had been designed specifically to detect unclassifiable relationships. Elias read the notice while standing in a corridor that had finally decided to judge him openly. The lights were too bright. The floor hummed with restrained disapproval. He folded the notice and slipped it into his pocket, where it joined several others. They rustled together like nervous paper birds. This time, the meeting was in the hall of petition again. That was intentional. Elias stood on the same floor markings as before, noticing how much smaller the space felt now. Or perhaps it was not smaller. Perhaps he was simply less inclined to be intimidated by architecture that tried too hard. The nobles filled the tiers, restless and alert. Speculation had matured into expectation. They had prepared themselves for scandal, betrayal, or revelation. Several of them looked almost disappointed that no one had been arrested yet. Queen Ashera sat on the throne, crown in place, posture flawless. The bioluminescent lines beneath her skin were subdued, disciplined. She looked every bit the monarch they needed her to be. Elias wondered, not for the first time, how exhausting that must be. "Elias of no house," Ashera said, her voice carrying cleanly through the hall. "You are summoned to clarify the nature of your boon." Here it was, the end of the anomaly. The moment when whatever they had been building would be translated into something the Empire could categorize, dissect, and render harmless. Elias stepped forward. He felt calmer than he expected. Somewhere along the way, the fear had been replaced with something sturdier. "I believe," he said, "that has already been clarified." A murmur rose. Ashera lifted a hand, and silence fell, obedient and sharp. "The court," she said, "disagrees." Elias nodded. "The court often does." A ripple of scandalized amusement passed through the tiers. Ashera's eyes flicked to him. Warning, amusement, gratitude, all at once. "Very well," she said. "Then speak plainly. What is it you have taken from your queen?" Elias considered the phrasing. He smiled faintly. "Nothing," he said. "That's the point." Outrage surged, then stalled as Ashera did not react. "I asked for your time," Elias continued. "You gave it, freely, no leverage, no obligation beyond honesty. I didn't gain power. I didn't gain status. I gained perspective." "And what?" demanded a noble from the third tier, unable to contain himself. "Did the queen gain?" Ashera answered before Elias could. "Silence," she said. The words settled heavily. "I gained a space where I was not interpreted," she continued. "Not optimized, not preserved. I was spoken to without expectation of outcome. That is rare." The court shifted uneasily. This was not the explanation they had prepared arguments against. "As ruler," Ashera said, rising from the throne, "I am surrounded at all times by advisors, by data, by projections of my own future reactions. This arrangement," she gestured subtly toward Elias, "did not weaken my authority. It reminded me why it exists." Elias watched her, seeing the careful balance she struck now, the way she bridged the distance between queen and woman without collapsing either. "I will not apologize," she said, "for choosing conversation over conquest." Silence followed. Then slowly, reluctantly, the tension eased. Not resolved, but defanged. The court had no language for this kind of victory. Later, much later, after procedures and formalities and a ceremonial acknowledgement that satisfied no one and offended fewer than expected, Elias found himself once again in a forgotten corridor. Ashera joined him there, crown removed, expression tired and wry. "Well," she said, "we survived." "I think they're more confused than ever," Elias replied, "which I choose to see as success." She leaned against the wall, ignoring its polite attempt to adjust itself for her comfort. "They will move on," she said. "Courts always do. There will be new scandals, new fears." "And us?" Elias asked. Ashera met his gaze. "Us," she said, "will continue. Not as a secret, not as a threat, simply as two people who had chosen not to reduce each other to function." Elias nodded. He felt different, not elevated, not important, but steadier. He had not gained land or title. He had learned something harder and rarer, that proximity to power did not have to consume you, and that seeing someone clearly was not the same as claiming them. Ashera turned to leave, then paused. "You know," she said, "you never did ask for anything else." Elias shrugged. "I got what I wanted." She smiled then, not the careful curve reserved for public addresses, but the small, genuine one he recognized. "So did I." They went their separate ways through a palace that no longer quite knew what to make of them. Above, the empire continued its vast, complex motion, ships jumping lanes, systems stabilizing, History's being written by people who would never quite understand what had shifted. And that was fine. Some changes did not need monuments. Some only needed two lonely people brave enough to ask for something no one else thought to want, and wise enough to leave it exactly as it was, freely given and freely returned.